couple of you have been asking for my post-banlist take. Unfortunately, I was delayed by some hardware issues, so instead of doing something that has already been done, I thought it could be more productive to instead look at how the format will change due to both the banlist and burst protocol. Now this is going to be a long one, there's a lot of decks to discuss, so I highly recommend pacing yourself as you go through this. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my thoughts. Let's get into it. So jumping right into things, I think Lunalight will be tier 1 of post-banlist. Now, I know for a while Lunalight has felt as though it's been like a tier 1.5, tier 2 deck, but it actually gained quite a bit from the banlist. And when I say that, I mean it gained a lot of things indirectly. So the obvious is that a lot of its competition in things like Yami, Mitsurugi, Dracotail, even K9, all of those decks kind of received some kind of nerf in some capacity, and Lunalight kind of went off the list scot-free. Apart from that, we also saw that Droll Decks is now a 2. So I know I've said this countless times, but Lunalight isn't exactly a deck that has a problem against Droll Decks in that it can play through it. But a lot of times when you play through Droll Decks, you are settling to end on one Liger plus maybe something else if you're lucky. In other words, you're ending on a half board, and with the Droll now at 2, you are more likely to combo off, which means you don't always have to rely on these half boards and hope that it's enough to kind of push through. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about Droll, and a lot of people are saying that putting it to 2 instead of 3 doesn't really change much. I think if you're looking at the math, it kind of decreases the consistency of seeing it in a 40 card list by about 10%, which doesn't seem like much until you remember that the way the Yugioh is structured right now, at a YCS, which is probably like the highest level of competitive play that you'll see outside of like a nationals and anything higher than that, is that you're going to play like 15 plus rounds. And when you are, that 10% decrease in consistency is huge. So I wouldn't be surprised if Lunalight kind of wins the next event, but I feel as though it is a deck that does its best when people aren't prepared for it. So I feel as though that within the first week or two, it's definitely going to be taking a lot of people by surprise, or rather, you know, it'll just be doing what it's supposed to do. It'll be doing pretty well. But as the format progresses, we could see it drop to tier 1.5 when it starts being respected. But I think for now, putting it at tier 1 is a fair thing to say, and I think a lot of people agree with that too. I think Yami was the deck most hit by the banlist. Like, it kind of felt as though Konami had 2 bullets in their rifle and they decided to use both of those on Yami. It lost its Arclight, its Snatchy went to 1, and on top of that, it was predominantly played with Mitsurugi, and Habakiri was limited. So Yami feels like as though it's a bit of a weird space right now, which is why I'm putting it in tier 2. I feel as though the deck right now, before you get the burst protocol support, is very susceptible to Nibiru and what is it called, Darklord or more, because you don't have a Snatchy engrave to sort of summon to your field in case they use that against you. Or, you know, players could adapt and sort of play so that they have a synchro on the field and the Snatchy in the graveyard. But again, it's not as optimal as you'd want it to be, because you're kind of playing around the card that your opponent maybe has. But there's been a lot of talks around this and how to sort of adapt it. I think what's called Yugioh kind of said that you don't play Yami with a K9 or Noroi package, and it kind of accounts for a lot of the deck's weaknesses right now. You can also end on something like an F8 or Dragster, which gives the deck a much needed spell trap negate, which is something that could push the ceiling of the deck a bit higher. But it's also a little bit of a hard pill to swallow. Having invested in one deck from Josh and now having to invest in another engine, it feels a little bit iffy, right? But I guess, you know, the whole point of a banlist is always going to be to direct sales, and this is one of the ways in which Konami has done that. So K9 Yami might be the way to play the deck, but I've also seen a lot of discussions around wanting to play the new, I think it's the Tri-Brigade Springlands kits, believe that is what it's called. I think there is some way that it has synergizes with Yami well, and I guess that's something we'll have to see in the weeks to come, or at least I don't know right now while I'm recording this video. But that'll probably change in the days to come, and it could give the deck life. For now, I feel as though it is safest to put it in tier 2 just because it has lost a good amount, but it could adapt, and in which case we could put it into tier 1. So one of these two, so I'm either saying top of tier 2, bottom of tier 1.5, that makes sense. So we could move it around as things progress. Looking at the K9 decks, some interesting things have happened, right? So the obvious is that both Yokul and A Case for K9 were limited, which means that pure K9 is not going to feel as viable as you'd think it would be. Of course, the deck can account for this by playing more copies of Chaotic Elements, but it does feel as though the deck is now trying to build the perfect hand by using all of these search tools before it gets to play, which isn't a bad place to be, but it just feels as though the pure version of the deck took the biggest hit from the banlist. What am I saying? So For that, I'm saying Pure Canine is probably in tier 2. There's some cool things it can do, and it's a cool control deck, but I feel as though it is somewhat lacking when you compare it to some of the other control options in the format. However, the decks that are playing Canine seem to be in a good position in that they were reworked. So I'm putting Canine Crystron in tier 1.5. The best part about this deck right now is that it can still play the Spell Canceller, which I was expecting to be banned on the ban list, but you know, that kind of went scotch-free. And now this deck is able to put up a stun in the Spell Canceller, which is pretty good for it. I also think that it hasn't really lost anything in the grand scheme of things, because yes, Yokul and the case for Canine were limited, but then it also gained inclusion back to 3. So this is a nice little rework which makes the deck overall feel about as good as it did before. There are cases where you're going to feel as though you are fighting to get to a Yokul, but you can easily kind of make up for this again with Chaotic Elements and playing more copies of Lantern. I think the way the combo performs now, you basically end on the same endboard as you did before. It's just, I wouldn't even say it's weaker because you make a Ripper very early, so you don't have to worry about Droll. If you guys want to check that out, I think Yassine posted a video on how Canine Crystron has adapted to sort of the ban list, and it's basically the same. The ban list didn't really affect it as a whole, it just kind of sort of affected more of the other Canine decks in general. Speaking of which, I kind of feel as though Vanquish Soul Canine is tier 1.5 for the reason that they have fewer level 5s now. So it feels as though the deck was kind of flipped on its head, where before the ban list it felt as though the Canine portion of the deck was more consistent than the Vanquish Soul, and now post ban list it feels as though the Vanquish Soul is more consistent than the Canine portions, which is I guess okay because the deck still has its core identity of being a Vanquish Soul deck, as it should. It just means that it can't really rely on its Canine tools as well as it could have before. I think this is an okay place for the deck to be. I know a lot of people are saying that it's now tier 1, and I think out of respect to them I'll just put it there. But in my opinion it feels as though you're playing more of a Vanquish Soul deck, as I've been saying repetitively, but it doesn't feel bad, it doesn't feel great. It's a bit of an interesting rework because, you know, the Vanquish Soul's cards are very good, but I feel as though it is not as good going second anymore, and for that reason I would want to put it in tier 1.5, but I'm going to respect the opinions of everyone else by putting it in tier 1. Mermail is in a bit of an interesting situation where I'm going to put it in a rogue. So obviously the ban list did get rid of the water statue, which is something that should have happened in the previous list, but I guess Konami's logic was that Mermail wasn't really doing anything and the barrier statue was sort of integral to its identity, so they left it at sort of unlimited for after that emergency ban list. But since then we have seen a resurgence of Mermail players, especially at a regional level, and it has been topping quite a lot. I think at its peak it took both the first and second slots at I think some European regionals, so it definitely is something that garners a lot of respect, especially when going first, because it could just hand rip your opponent for like 2 or 3 and on a barrier statue and they just couldn't play, which is a very frustrating type of gameplay, but it is a type of gameplay nonetheless. And post banlist they obviously got rid of the water statue, which means that the deck should feel bad, but not exactly, because you can easily replace the water statue with, I forget what this is called, I think it's like Tetsudo Eretnumon, something like that. It's a level 1 aqua monster that basically says monsters with 1800 or more attack cannot be special summoned, so, which is somewhat like the barrier statue. You can search it and summon it the same way you would as the barrier statue. It's just that you would be using this instead, and the attack restriction kind of feels as though it is worse than the water statue, but when you kind of look at the format, and Yami feels as though it's falling out of favor, and if it does, then Mermail is going to feel about as good as it did before. So I don't think it's dead just yet. It did take a hit, but it can still do the same thing it was always doing. It's just a little bit different now. So only time will tell if it is fair. I think it won't be as represented within the first month of the ban list as you would think it would be. But if it is, maybe just try and think about how you can sort of deal with this matchup. I think Breakers is obviously the way to go against them, because then you kind of just turn off the flight gate that they have on the other side of the field. Of course, try to stay away from things as target, because they can sort of construct their board in a way where the statue will have target and protection. So just something to keep at the back of your mind. Maybe it won't see itself in the format, but if it does, then at least you know more or less how to deal with it. Darklord is obviously getting new support in Burst Protocol, and there's a lot of talk about it being somewhat of a good mid-range strategy that should be somewhat affordable to play. So for those of you who don't know, so the new Darklord identity is kind of that it plays a bunch of hand traps. I believe the deck can play like 18 non-engine, and it sort of has the 1 card combo that sort of creates a scenario where you can fusion summon during your opponent's turn. You then summon out one of your Darklords, which kind of destroys all monsters, or I think it's all monsters or all cards in the field on your opponent's side of the field, which is pretty good. So it has a cool little unique space in the meta right now because it's doing something a little bit different, although it is still a mid-range deck. But I feel as though one of its weaknesses is that the deck itself feels as though it is somewhat susceptible to being hand-trapped early. So it kind of feels like how, what do I call it? Like how Marensis felt back in the day. So it could play a lot of non-engine, but it could also be stopped fairly easily. And because of that, I feel as though I'm going to put it in Rogue. So either Rogue or Tier 2. For now, I'm just putting in Rogue because I feel as though there are going to be quite a few hand trap decks like K9 and the K9 variants. And if Yami is around, they'll obviously be playing a lot of hand traps too, and we can't forget about Draco Tail. And because of that, it's going to feel as though this deck's going to have a very hard time to get itself going. Now, of course, this does mean that it gets to play the hand trap wall of attrition, in that if it has more hand traps in its hand than the opponent has, then we're just playing this game where we're just trying to stop each other until one of us runs out of hand traps, in which case we get to play, which is a style of Yugioh I don't exactly like, but I do know a lot of people do like that, and I think it could have potential, but for now, just because it has that glaring weakness, I struggle to put it in a higher tier, and I feel as though it's something that you kind of have to pick to take your opponent by surprise, and assuming your opponent doesn't know what your deck does, you'll do pretty well with it, but if they do, you might find yourself in a situation where you're struggling a bit. In my opinion, Maliss is now a tier 2 deck. It's probably one of the ones on the lower end of the spectrum. Now, it obviously did take a good hit losing its white binder, which was so important to the deck, but I feel as though a lot of the players have somewhat adapted to this. They've already started replacing the white binder with Transcode Torko, which allows them to end on a similar end board than they did before. Of course, what the end board now lacks is that it lacks a way to summon the white binder during your opponent's turn to sort of rip 3 from the graveyard, or however many in combination of yours and theirs. And that is of course a sizable hit, but I think one of the things that will allow the deck to still be played in some capacity is the fact that everybody thinks that it's going to be dead and out of the game. And because of that, they'll probably be taking Lancia out of their side deck, and if they are, that means a lot of times you're going to be able to combo off as effectively as you were previously. I think there's also an argument to playing more of a Radient Typhoon package in here, just because the Radient Typhoon engine sort of gives you a lot of somewhat good control tools, but apart from that, in Maliss it also is engine being able to get your play started. By making a Cherubini sends your Dormouse to the graveyard. You then make a what's it called, a Lizardos. The Lizardos banishes the Dormouse from your graveyard, summon the Dormouse, and then your play's all started. So good synergy between those two decks, and I feel as though that could help the deck push a bit forward and maintain some place in the meta. I don't think it's definitely not going to feel as good as it was in the past, but if you're like dedicated to Maliss, the good news is that it's still somewhat playable. I think Elfnote, or is it Elfnote now, will be tier 1. So we saw in the OCG that when this deck released, it was doing pretty well for itself for a good while until people started to adapt and sort of respect it, and then we saw it kind of drop to lower tiers. I think a similar trend will follow in the TCG, where during the first month or so it'll be very good, and as people adapt we'll start to see it drop to maybe tier 1.5. For now, I feel confident in putting tier 1. It's a good deck. If you're thinking about picking it up, or if you have already invested in sort of the Archmage lore, then now is a good time to pick up a deck that should actually be meta relevant. I know Konami kind of baited us with the first wave of Archmage support when like the initial archetype was released, or lore archetype was released, and then we got Doom Z, which seemed promising. It had some incredible art and a lot of people invested into it, but unfortunately Doom Z kind of felt as a deck that basically ended on one guy and a trap which turned it into Colossus. And while we know that Thunder Dragon isn't doing anything, and unfortunately Doom Z wasn't able to do so either. That all changes with Elfnote, and I feel as though this could be one of the decks to pick up and play, especially if you are hell-bent on playing a lore archetype. I do think that it might be somewhat lacking until it gets the second wave of support, but I think it's good enough considering how this list sort of nerfed everything else in the competition. So I wouldn't be surprised if I can put it at the top of the tiers. I think for now, just as a new deck and based on the inexperience that players will have, I feel confident in putting tier 1, especially when Lunalight can easily drop based on how well your opponent is respecting it. So top of tier 1 for now. Time will tell if this is true. Next up, I'm putting Enneacraft in Rogue. So I know this has kind of won it's done pretty well in topping a few regionals since its release, and It's a pretty cool deck that does something unique and new, but I feel as though until it gets its new support, it won't really be as reliable as the rest of the decks in the format right now. So I think a big part of this deck's success is because a lot of people don't respect it and they don't bother to learn what it does. And that obviously catches them by surprise. Obviously, it has a ton of control tools in the cards that are face down. They can just flip themselves face up when certain conditions are met, and then they apply some kind of control-like effect. Apart from that, I think the deck just burns your opponent absolutely ridiculously, so it has a well-established win con. It feels a lot like Runic in my opinion, that it's doing something a bit different and it's trying to win without just needing to attack your opponent, which is kind of cool. But I think the biggest weakness of the deck right now is that it has to go first, right? It doesn't really do a whole lot when going second, and because you're somewhat dice roll dependent, I feel less confident to put it higher. So I feel as though it is a rogue deck that kind of depends on your opponent not knowing what it does to do well. And I also think a lot of people don't know that Evenly Match is just such an incredible blowout card against this deck. So in a world where Enneacraft starts becoming the better deck, it starts to feel less good because people shouldn't just start playing Evenly Match again, and it's just such a good blowout card. In fact, I feel as though this format Evenly is something that you should consider because it is both good against Enneacraft and I guess even Dracotail, and that's something that we need to respect a lot. So Dracotail Flame can't negate traps, so if you resolve and Evenly, you're basically getting rid of most of their back row, maybe except one, and then they just have the fusion in hand, which is still a lot, but it simplifies things a lot. And if Enneacraft is actually catching strays from a card that checks other decks or better decks, then you know it's not exactly in a good position unless you really like the archetype and you're confident that you can sort of capitalize on people's ignorance to do well. I'm going to put Exosister in tier 1.5. I think it's got some of the best support out there, so it's obviously a deck that a lot of people are anticipating, which is really cool because Exosister hasn't really seen play since 2023, I believe, and even then it was sort of fallen out of favor, right? So usually when Konami gives an old deck support, they usually give it 4 pieces of support, like 4 new names, and that's usually what pushes the deck to new playable levels. Exosister only got 2, but right, both of those 2 cards it got feel like custom cards, right? So Carmyle, the new Xyz, kind of changes the deck in a way that it loses its weakness to Nibiru, right? In the past, Nibiru was something that absolutely crippled the deck, and now the deck has, I want to call it an Omni Negate, but it's a bit better than that because it changes your opponent's effect, and changes your opponent's effect in the best way possible, because once you change your opponent's effect, you then get to add something from your graveyard to your hand, which is incredible. Like, you're negating something of theirs while gaining more resources, which is just something that is kind of unheard of before. Apart from that, the deck also, Carmyle also sets a trap during your end phase, which means you're now in a position where you can end on both your Exosister traps to sort of control the game, which gives you somewhat of a layered board. It also received Exosister Betrayal, which was previously called Bat Matter, which is one of the craziest things I've ever read. It's a continuous spell that lets you add 2 Exosisters from your deck to your hand, and then you have to discard a card from hand. It gives you an additional normal summon, provided that your normal summoning's name is mentioned on one of the Exosisters you have on your field already. And then the third effect banishes a card from your opponent's graveyard when it is sent there. This is also just the once per turn. Now, unfortunately, in the TCG, there might have been somewhat of a translation error on Betrayal. In the OCG, Betrayal's effect that banishes a card from the graveyard makes your opponent banish it, which will obviously trigger a lot of your Exorcism monsters' effects. Whereas in the TCG, it says you, the person who owns the Betrayal, banishes a card from your opponent's graveyard. So it is worded in a very weird way. This could just be a typo, but if it is a case where there is just differences in effects between the OCG and the TCG, it could affect things slightly. I don't think too much though, because Betrayal is still such an incredible card. Like, having something that allows you to just sort of disrupt your opponent's graveyard is always going to feel huge, especially in a deck that gets to play a ton of non-engine, that has a new custom Xyz monster to end on that basically gives you the traps which prevent your opponent from touching their graveyard, and if they do, they get locked out of it for the game or for the turn, which should just be enough because the deck can somehow, well, I won't say it can OZK easily, but if it's allowed to go first and simplify the game state, then it can OZK pretty well, because you can just make a Magnifica which can attack twice, you can banish one, and along the way to make your Magnifica, you're going to banish one with your Maliss. So it feels good. It feels as though it is something that's going to need to garner a lot of respect, especially people who are not entirely sure how to adapt their plays so that they don't touch their graveyard. I think one of the shortcomings of this deck is that it has a big weakness to Forbidden Crown. First month that it sees play, I think it'll be a solid tier 1.5 option, for the reason that I don't suspect many people will be able to get their hands on Crown in time for the YCS that I believe is on the 14th of February. So after that, I imagine the deck might start falling out, but again, it is something that should be able to do well, depending on how well you can use your hand traps, right? So something that we might see a lot of experienced players play. I think Steven Stantoli, he did really well with Exosisters when they first released, so I imagine he'll be playing the new deck, and we'll just need to wait to see what he cooks up, and if he does, then if he is successfully able to cook something up, then I think that's something that a lot of players will follow suit, and we could see Exosister being just one of the most prominent forces of the meta. But I think for now, 1.5 tier 2 feels good. I think it's a little bit better than what I have in tier 2, so I'm putting in tier 1.5 confidently. Another deck getting new support is Radient Typhoon. Of course, it's just getting its second wave of support, unlike Exosister, which is getting support after a couple of years. And what's interesting is that this deck was predicted to be the best deck of the room, well, the best deck of the format and the best deck in the room, right? So by virtue of it being able to play Featherstorm right now, it's kind of unheard of for Konami to ban one of the most marketable cards in the game right now before it gets a chance to sort of, I don't want to say shine because that card is just degenerate, but a time to see more play than it has in the past. I think, for those of you who don't know, Radiant Typhoon obviously gets to play Featherstorm, and Konami kind of listened to the pleas of the community instead of the pleas of their wallets by banning the card before we had to deal with it in Radiant Typhoon. So in the OCG, this deck is dominating the format by virtue of the fact that it just has so many control tools, or very good control tools, and then on top of that, it just had an auto win in Featherstorm. So I'm not entirely sure what the deck does now that it doesn't have Featherstorm. Obviously, I did mention that it has a lot of control tools which could allow it to sort of dictate the pace of the game, especially being a deck that relies on quick play spells as opposed to trap cards. I think that is something that gives it some use going second, as opposed to most control decks that just want to go first, and if they don't, then they're in a bad position. So I think it will still be tier 1, and especially it will catch a lot of people off guard, and I think especially if it'll be splashed into a lot of decks, it could be a very powerful engine. But I feel as though when things settle, it'll be top of tier 1.5. So you guys can let me know what it is. I'm obviously not super knowledgeable about what this deck does now, as I've said, since it lost Featherstorm. And because of that, I think I'm not the best person to give you an honest opinion on this, or a rather truthful opinion on this. And I don't want to spread misinformation, so obviously take what I'm saying about Radiant Typhoon with a grain of salt. So for now, I'm going to put it in tier 1.5. I'll put it at the top of tier 1.5, and I'll leave it to you guys to decide where it should actually go. I've also heard some people say that it just makes every other win deck better, but I'm not entirely sure which win deck would kind of use it. One that comes to mind is Ritual Beast, but I really doubt that this can be played in Ritual Beast in some capacity, especially when Ritual Beast's whole identity was basically doing parkour just to end on a, what is it called, a Protoss, and I can't do that anymore, so it feels as though this wouldn't be played in that. So I'm not sure what win decks we'll see play, but sure, maybe there's something that just kind of comes out of nowhere and it'll take everyone by surprise, in which case, you know, Radiant Typhoon did its job and it's tier 1, but by itself, I don't know. Like, I really don't know. I'm counting on you guys for this one. I want to talk about both White Forest and Sky Striker in the same token, or the same breath, right? Because they kind of benefited from the ban list in the same way, in that they benefit from the fact that Droll Decks is now semi-limited, which means that these two decks, which otherwise had an imposing Silver Bullet, can play the game without having to worry about it as much as before. So it is going to feel as though they're going to need some luck, because assuming you dodge Droll all the time, they're going to find their way to the top tables, but if you don't, then it's going to feel like it's going to sink down below. So obviously great. I think the biggest buff came to White Forest in that it no longer needs to play Sales Van because of the Warrior of Droll, and I think now you can confidently play one Crossfire Designator and 2 Droll in your deck instead of playing multiple copies of Sales Van, which usually felt like a -1 unless your opponent had the Droll already in hand. But a lot of times you're not going to know that, and you're just kind of playing with a 4-card hand out of fear of a card that they may or may not have. So I think this is definitely a good buff to the deck, and I think it could see more play, especially when considering how versatile it is. But if we're talking in versatility, and if that's my argument, then Sky Striker has to be above, because it is, well, question the most versatile deck in the game, being that almost all of your spell traps don't have a hard once per turn, and they sort of help you play in almost any situation. Like, it's also, I think, the format's premium going second deck, but even when it's forced to go first, it can still do something, in that I've played against Skystrike a couple of times online, and there's been more than a few times where I forced them to go first and they would activate Heatwave and Chain Linkage, and they would summon out the 0. I would have nothing because obviously Heatwave, and then they would just combo off during their turn with the 0 and OTK me there and then. So it has a cheeky way of winning when going first, so it kind of feels a lot like how Tempai did. And I mean, Tempai was a tier 1 deck for a while. I'm just putting it tier 1.5 for now because I think we're still waiting on the new support. I don't think I forgot what the new one's name is, but I don't believe it's in Burst Protocol. If it is, put Skystrike in tier 1. But until we get that, I'm going to feel as though a good place to put it is in tier 1.5. And when he gets the new support, it's just going to feel absolutely amazing as probably one of the best decks in the room, just as it is in the OCG. Habakiri is limited, but I don't think pure Mitsurugi is dead, right? I feel as though it is a very solid option to still consider, especially when considering the amount of tools that it gets to play and the fact that this deck has almost no restriction on it, so that it can be played in basically anything. I would like to see it being played in more ritual decks, but I feel as though it is now in a position where if Mitsurugi is to do well, then nobody can really complain about it because we all got what we wanted, which was a Habakiri limited or Habakiri limit, and it feels as though the deck is less splashable in the decks at the top table. So it is something that's going to garner a lot of respect. I think it is still pretty decent as a deck that is able to go first or second, and I think that is something you always need to consider when playing this game, is that you need to build a deck that can go first or second, because you can't rely on the die roll all the time. So I know mid-range decks kind of fill or meet this criteria by being able to play a ton of hand traps, and a lot of them are built in a way where they can play like 2, 3, or they play so many hand traps that they're very likely to see 2 to 3 in the opening hand all of the time. But I feel as though with hand traps you have to draw the right ones for the right situation, and because of that they can feel a little bit iffy. And remember I said that you draw 2 or 3 of them in your opening hand, but a lot of times you can see duplicates, which is going to feel as though it's a less. So I'm not saying mid-range decks are bad, I just feel as though decks that have an in-archetypal way of breaking boards when going second will always have an advantage, and because of that I feel as though Mitsurugi feels as though it's going to still be pretty good. Now, I don't know how many people are going to be playing it, but if they are, I imagine it's still going to be a force to be reckoned with. So there's a couple of decks that I kind of want to talk about together. So Dracotail, which I'm putting as the best deck in the room, Blue Eyes, which I'm putting above Darklord, Kultunes, which I'm putting in tier 2, and Ryzeal, which I'm putting behind Darklord. So all of these 4 decks are mid-range decks that rely on playing a high number of hand traps to kind of simplify the game state, and then combo on from there using their consistent 1-card starters. So I think Blue Eyes is probably the most mid-range deck there is in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it is still something that is, I feel, unloved or sort of underrepresented for what it is. As a mid-range deck, it also does something very different by being able to play the Primate Engine, which gives the deck so many good tools for when going second. It also gives the deck much needed protection against blowout cards like Evenly Matched and Dark Blue No More. And because of this, I feel as though Blue Eyes is probably the best of the conventional mid-range decks that there has been in Yu-Gi-Oh, or that is available to play right now. I think it's better than Darklord, so if you're thinking about investing in Darklord but you have Blue Eyes, I wouldn't recommend it unless you just happen to really like Darklord, because from a competitive standpoint, I don't think it's going to do anything that Blue Eyes isn't. And I think the only bad thing you can say about Blue Eyes is that it is playing a few bricks, but I guess it's not the worst thing, because I mean we have seen this deck do well in the past, and I don't see any reason why it can't do so now in a learned player's hands. Kultune is a bit of a step above it in my opinion, in the sense that it is able to synchro summon during turn 0, and because of this, the deck has more ways of interacting with your opponent. It is able to play about the same amount of hand traps, or non-engine being able to play between 15 and 18 if you count the clip, and because of that it also has more use when going second, apart from the turn 0 play, but for the reason that when it synchro summons like Dracotail, it has the ability to sort of proc a lot of these grave effects that can destroy opponent's monsters. I think they also have one that can negate something, and then it can also disrupt your opponent's deck and extra deck. So it feels pretty good. It should be talked about in the same breath as Dracotail, and I think there is an argument where you could push it up to tier 1.5. But I think until we get the new support, it's going to feel as though it's safest in tier 2. But actually, I think we've seen it top a couple of regionals lately. Well, not win them, but make the top 8. So I'm going to put it in tier 1.5 out of respect to that. And it's just something that is pretty cool all around. And I think once it gets the new support, it'll definitely be tier 1. But until then, we're going to put it in tier 1.5. So Dragatail, despite receiving 2 hits in that both Mululu and what was it called, Ketsu got limited, the deck is still pretty good and in a similar position than it was before, being able to that it can just set basically anything that it wants to from the deck, so it doesn't really care about losing Ketsu all too much. But beyond that, it's gaining indirect support in the new branded support and the Magistus cards, so it is able to adapt to what is going to be played in the format. We still see in the OCG that this is probably one of the best decks in the room, so I don't think, even though that we have fewer Mululu, that it'll change this. It's something that's going to dominate, and I think something that we also need to talk about is that it got an indirect buff in that K9 got nerfed, so that we should see fewer K9 decks running around, which was historically something of a silver bullet to Dragatail. So I feel confident in putting it as tier 1 as the best deck in the room, for the reason that in a skill pilot's hand, it's just going to feel absolutely oppressive, being able to interact with you at the points where you want your opponent to interact with you the least, and then it just has the ability to go first or second, which I think is just key to playing the game right now. So Dragatail, best deck, best of all the mid-range decks, and if you can't afford Dragatail or you don't want to play it, then Kultsun and Blue Eyes are probably your next best options. Ryziel is also pretty decent, but the reason why I'm putting it below Blue Eyes is for the reason that it kind of loses to Forbidden Crown. Like if they use that on your detonator, then they just essentially have a bot in the field that's not going to do anything, right? So I feel as though Kultsun and Blue Eyes do more than it, which is why I'm ranking them above, and then Dragatail is obviously the best of the bunch, which is why it's a tier 1. I think Orcust is a solid tier 2 deck, especially when it's paired with another engine. Of course, we recently saw it win a regional when played pure. It was just played as a sort of a mid-range deck that is able to do cool things. I feel as though there is some variance between your normal summons, which feels a little bit iffy at times, but of course the Link one does fix this to a large degree. There's also the argument where playing Orcust alongside K9s to make an early River Stormer to search for a Scrap Recycler, which you can then summon off of your Platinum gadgets to get exactly the card that you want into the graveyard when you want it, without relying on your Link 1 too much. So, or rather just gives it more consistency, and then Izuna's obviously just a great hand trap. So I feel as though it's good, probably the best of the tier 2 decks so far that I've put. Something that I think is slept on, especially when considering that it is an Impulse deck. Obviously you can't play Impulse along with the K9 cards, but I mean, it's doing a lot of things right. It just feels as though, I feel as though there's some variance in their normal summons, which I guess the Link one kind of corrects, but it still feels somewhat iffy, especially if your opponent can sort of get rid of the body without sending it to the graveyard. So if like you normal summon and you're playing Orcust and your opponent just uses like something like a compulsory evacuation device to return it to your hand, I feel as though Orcust can't really do too much from that kind of situation. So if you can get rid of the normal summon without sending it to the graveyard, it feels iffy in my opinion, which is why I like cards like Scrap Recycler, which have, trigger effects on summon, which allow you to get your plays going without needing to fear sort of these removal tools that your opponent might have. So again, it's going to feel like one of those decks when it's allowed to go first, it's going to feel good. But when it's going second, it's going to feel a bit iffy. So maybe there's an argument to put it behind Mitsurugi, but I think what puts it ahead is, of course, it's able to play just a ton of non-engine. And it's able to play probably the best breaker in the game, or one of the best breakers in the game, in Forbidden Droplet. And it gets to play Droplet for free, because like anything you send to the graveyard is going to give you a net plus. So I feel more confident putting it above Mitsurugi for its consistency reasons. I think it's somewhat slept on, but not so slept on that people don't suspect it. I just think it's a solid pick all around. I think we need to talk about DDD and Dragon Link in the same breath. I feel as though both of these will be solid tier 2 options that you can consider. They end on crazy explosive end boards that feel very oppressive, and both of them can also play a good amount of non-engine or hand traps, which makes them feel a bit better than mid-range decks in that they're able to play the hand traps while still ending on a very powerful end board that's going to feel a lot like some of the best combo decks in the game right now. Now, the reason why I don't put these higher despite the praise that I've just given them is the reason that both of them have a weakness to Mulcharmies, right? So I don't think there is a way that you can kind of play through a Mulcharmy without giving your opponents a significant amount of draws. Dragon Link kind of feels as though it also has a weakness to Perulia, whereas DDD feels as though it only has a weakness to 4-loss. So Dragon Link, 4-loss, and Perulia hits it hard, whereas DDD, it just feels or more feels like it's just the full loss. I think in DDD, if your opponent full losses you twice, your win condition then becomes to just deck your opponent out. Like, that is how much this deck summons from the deck and extra deck. So it is something to always consider, and when considering that the Silver Bullet is something that people are playing in their main decks and not their side decks, it becomes a little bit iffy to kind of recommend them. I also feel as though enough time has kind of passed where people really know what DDD do, and Dragoning was obviously a popular deck in the past, so people who played back then will know how to deal with them to a large degree. And yeah, so DDD was my sleeper deck, or the sleeper deck that I recommended the most. But I think over November, December, we kind of saw it do pretty well at a remote regional, maybe one or two of those, and because of that, more people started playing it. And if you play online, you'll be more familiar with this deck. And then of course, there is the thing about it having its support in Master Duel, so it's gaining a lot of attention now. So I feel as though it is less like just to slip underneath the radar and sort of catch your opponent off guard, because they'll have some experience when playing against it. I forgot to talk about Fire King. I think it's on par with Blue Eyes. It's doing more or less a similar thing. I think the big difference is that the Jurak Meteor is kind of cool. So I'm not entirely sure where I'd put these two. I think they're neck and neck, so I'm just going to put it next to Blue Eyes. I should have spoken about it with Blue Eyes, but just know it's more or less the same. Okay, we're now down to the last 4 decks, and I'm putting Memento as the sleeper deck of the format. This deck has lost nothing despite being a deck that won back-to-back YCSs, I believe last year or the year before. No, it was last year. And it's just incredible what this deck is able to do. It can go first or second. It's going first end board is more interruptions than you can probably count on your hands, and that is something to say. It obviously has a good and well established going second option, being able to OZK your opponent via Akihiron, and it's just something that people need to keep an eye out for. So I feel as though in a world where everything else got nerfed, which we are currently in, where basically every other deck besides maybe Lunalight kind of received some kind of indirect hit, that Memento can now rise to the top because of those things. So we've already seen it see more play in the last week or two, and I wouldn't be surprised if it starts putting up numbers comparative to your tier 1.5 and tier 2 decks. I just feel as though in terms of what it can do, it's definitely ahead of both of these decks. I just struggle to put in tier 1 because of representation. So when people start catch on and start playing this, then I'm going to put this in tier 1, because I feel as though it is just that slept on, especially when played with alongside the Radient Typhoon cards. But for now, I'm putting sleeper. We'll see how this changes in a month. I think Apophis Primite will also be somewhat slept on. Now, I'm not saying it's as good as Memento, but I feel as though as a control deck, a lot of attention will be on Radient Typhoon. But a lot of people will forget that you can play Primite Apophis, which is just very good because it is another one of these control decks that can go first or second, especially when it plays a lot of the Dominus cards. And apart from that, it does something very degenerate when going first, being able to search a floodgate of its choice via the Lord of the Heavenly Spheres, and then activate it the same turn, I believe with the continuous spell or the field spell, or just some combination of cards that they have in the field. They can basically activate trap cards the turn that they're set, so they can just fetch the floodgate that works best against your deck and just shut you out of the game then and there. So it's a very good stun control deck, and I think it's going to catch a lot of people by surprise. Gemini is Rogue, so I'm putting it at the bottom of Rogue because I feel as though it is a going second deck in the worst way possible. Now, I'm not trying to take a shot at Gemini because, you know, it's obviously done some good things in the past, but I feel as though it's lost a lot in the process. So it goes out here catching strays, and losing Protoss feels as though it's very huge for the deck because it now no longer has an established plan for when going first, and because of this, a lot of people have just decided to go all in and go in second by even playing like a Shadal package in the deck. My question though is, or rather my point that I'm trying to make is, as a go in second deck, it's very hard to recommend it over something like Sky Striker, which has more reliability when going second. Now of course Gemini can OTK a lot easier, but when you compare it to other decks that can OTK like Memento, Lunalight, it also just feels a little bad, especially when these two decks have the ability to play going first or second, where if you're playing a deck where your opponent knows has to go second and they make you go first, there's basically not much you can do. So I feel as though Gemini is in a weird situation, and I feel as though it needs something desperately, and because of that, I can't really recommend playing it unless you're just dedicated to the deck and you're just so good that your skill makes up for the lack in consistency. Well, not really the lack in consistency, the lack in reliability. Lastly, let's take a look at Branded, and I think Branded is going to be tier 1. So It's an interesting thing because I mean we haven't really seen branded a whole lot now, but it's obviously getting some new support which is going to give the deck some new life. And I think something that I've been saying throughout this video is that if you're playing something that can go first or go second, you're in a good position, and branded kind of fills, or rather meets, both of those criteria. And it also meets an additional criteria, being able to have an auto win strategy, or rather auto win condition when going first in the idle statue that it is able to summon. So unlike Mermail, the idle statue is pretty good for the reason that it summons your opponent's side of the field, so it's going to be a lot harder for them to get rid of it on their side of the field. And this is why I recommend that if you're playing a deck that is already on Thrust, to consider playing at least one copy of Darkhold in your side deck so that it can be used to get rid of the idle statue that you might have on your side of the field so that you can play. There's also the argument to play something like Book of Eclipse, which does a similar thing, although I feel as though being able to search Darkhold makes it the better of the two. Now, I'm not saying idle statue is an auto win, because there's a lot of decks that can kind of deal with it, right? So of course, Elfnote, Draco Tail, and K9 will be able to deal with it in some capacity, being able to tribute it and then kind of start their plays, right? So against K9, if they summon the idle statue to your side of the field and you tribute it to summon an Arroy, then guess what? You're in a good position because you're just going to go full combo from there. Elfnote, I think it's more similar because you'll just tribute the idle statue and then you'll summon the thing from your hand, not to your middle zone, and as long as you put it to something that isn't your middle zone, you can then special summon another one from your hand and kind of get your plays going from there. And then I think Draco Tail also has some level 5s or level 6s in their deck that they can use to distribute over and then start fusion summoning, assuming that they have something like a Ketsu. So it does have its shortcomings, but I feel as though a lot of times that'll be offset by the fact that it's just so hard to get something off your side of the field without, when you're not playing one of these decks. And it doesn't really need to rely on the idle statue too much because the branded inboard is still pretty good. I think the thing that holds branded back is what is the level of skill that you need to play it. And that's saying something because I think it is the most difficult deck to play in the game right now. So difficult, in fact, that the most complete branded guide on the internet is like 40 hours long. So yeah, it is something that you have to be very dedicated to, and I feel as if you're playing branded, that's all you're going to play because you're just so invested into it. But it is rewarding, right? So you probably will be working about 10 times harder than everyone else in the room for maybe the same results as another tier 1 deck. But if you are, committed, then you're playing something that is very difficult for your opponent to replicate unless they're willing to put in the same amount of time that you have.